My dad said I had to attend my perfect sister's wedding, or he'd cut off my tuition completely. He said it with the same cold certainty he used when telling me I wasn't creative enough to apply to the design program I got into anyway. I'm Olivia Dunn, 23 years old, a final year student at the New York Institute of Design. I specialize in industrial design, but what I really do is build meaning into form. Chairs, lighting, modular interiors, objects people overlook, I make them speak. I live in a shared apartment in Brooklyn, juggling school freelance work, and the quiet aching job of pretending I'm not hurt by how little my family thinks of me. My sister Sophia is 5 years older, an influencer with a glossy life and a fiancé in luxury branding. Her wedding has been compared to a Vogue editorial come to life by every aunt in the family. I wasn't just expected to be a bridesmaid. I was told point blank that if I didn't show up for fittings, rehearsals, and the full weekend program, I could find another way to pay for my final semester. My dad said it like a business transaction. He didn't ask how my thesis was going or whether I was healthy. He didn't know I was selected as one of only 3 students to exhibit at the Emerging Designers Gala. He had no idea because he never asked. And honestly, by now I had stopped offering. Growing up in the Dunn household meant living in Sophia's spotlight and learning to survive in its shadows. She was the face, the charm, the curated darling my parents boasted about. I was the detail they forgot to mention. The one with potential but no sparkle. Sophia was booked with modeling gigs in high school. I was in the garage, sketching folding mechanisms, and figuring out how to build a collapsible bench for my art teacher. When I won second place in a statewide STEM competition at 14, my parents missed the award ceremony to attend Sophia's live-streamed unboxing of a brand deal with Dior. I remember sitting on a plastic chair in a middle school gymnasium clutching my certificate while other parents clapped. That night, my mother said, "We're so proud of you," but never asked what the project was about. The only person who really listened to me back then was Aunt Valerie, my mom's older sister. She had once run her own interior studio in San Francisco and now lived alone away from the noise. When I was 16, I visited her during spring break and showed her a lamp I had made using only found materials and recycled copper wire. She looked at it for a long time, then said softly, "You're not loud about your talent, Olivia. That's why they don't see it. But it doesn't mean it's not real." Her words stuck with me longer than anything my parents ever said. By the time I reached college, I had perfected the art of strategic invisibility. I let them believe I was barely holding on while I quietly built a portfolio that would make most design interns jealous. I worked nights at a fabrication lab. I paid for my own Adobe license with freelance work they didn't know about. I got into NYID on a merit scholarship, but my father insisted on covering what the scholarship didn't to feel like he still had authority. I didn't argue, until this wedding. Until he pulled the one card he knew still held power tuition. He called one morning while I was wiring LED circuits for a lighting concept. I was running on 2 hours of sleep and 20 ounces of coffee. He didn't ask how I was. Just said, "Sophia expects you to be at the bridal fittings this weekend. You'll be staying with us at the Ritz. If you're not there, you'll need to figure out how to pay for your final term." The room spun for a moment. Not from shock, but from the exhaustion of knowing this was always coming. I asked if he could wait until after my final jury review next week. "No," he said. "Family comes first, especially when your sisters worked this hard to have the perfect day." I wanted to ask if he remembered anything I'd worked hard on. I wanted to scream that I had made a modular coffee table that got picked up by a boutique in Soho. That my concept for an eco-sustainable microhome had been shortlisted for the Sienna Award. But I said nothing. I just stared at the call screen, my hands shaking slightly from the soldering iron and lack of sleep. I didn't have the strength to fight him. Not then. So I said okay, and hung up. I didn't cry. I didn't text my friends. I went back to soldering. But something cold settled into my chest, something that told me this was the last time I'd let them define the frame I existed in. I would go. I would play my role. But I had already started preparing for something else entirely. I arrived at the Ritz lobby 5 minutes early, wearing black jeans and a white linen shirt, the same outfit I'd worn the day I got invited to submit my final year project to the Emerging Designers Gala. No one noticed. Sophia had sent a text with the phrase Dusty Pearl Elegance and a Pinterest board titled Bridesmaid Vibes. She didn't ask if I was okay with the style or the cost. She simply, Venmo requested $800 for the gown and fittings and wrote non-negotiable in the memo line. I didn't reply. I paid. That Saturday, the bridal suite was filled with champagne flutes, curling irons, and 7 versions of Sophia in slightly different heights and hairstyles. Her sorority sisters filled the air with sugary shrieks and compliments. I stood quietly near the windows, trying not to touch the silk furniture. When it was my turn to change into the dress, I took the smallest size on the rack. It still didn't fit. Lisa, Sophia's best friend since prep school, tilted her head and said, "Maybe we can add structure." Olivia's more minimalist. She meant flat. They all laughed, pretending it wasn't cruel. Sophia barely looked at me until the mirror moment. She circled me like a stylist in a rush, tugging at the bodice, then stepping back. "It's fine, we'll figure it out," she said. "But we need to move fast. Jason's family is super detail-oriented. Everything has to be perfect." That was the word that followed her everywhere: perfect. Her perfect fiancé. Her perfect venue. Her perfect sisterhood. I was the aesthetic exception, tolerated only out of obligation. After the fitting, she handed me a schedule. 3 full days of rehearsals, hair, trials, seating chart edits, photo walks, gift prep, and a welcome brunch. My name was highlighted on tasks like organize shoes by heel height and check mom's speech for typos. I wasn't asked to give a toast. I wasn't even in the front row of family portraits. When I asked why, Sophia said, "Because Elliot's niece is shorter and she'll balance the shot better. It's an aesthetic decision, not personal." But it was personal. Every inch of this wedding had been designed to erase nuance and present the family image Sophia had built on Instagram: flawless, curated, aspirational. That night, I returned to my dorm and worked on my thesis, while the others went out to celebrate her bachelorette dinner. My fingers moved across foam board and mesh wire, constructing a prototype I had spent 4 months developing. It was a kinetic seating design, lightweight, modular, responsive. I called it weightless. It looked like nothing but held everything. Professor Reeve had pulled me aside the week before and said, "Your piece is going to stop people in their tracks. It's pure tension and release." I thanked him and kept my voice even, but inside I felt something I hadn't allowed myself in years: hope. The week before the wedding, I got an email that changed everything. The gala had selected Weightless as one of the top 3 exhibits, and I would be presenting in front of investors, critics, and design firms from across the country. The only problem: it was scheduled the same day as Sophia's rehearsal dinner. I didn't hesitate. I clicked confirm attendance and made a mental note not to tell anyone. The next morning, my dad sent a group text reminding everyone that attendance is mandatory for all events unless someone's on life support. I didn't reply. I just stared at the message, then got back to work on the presentation mock-up. I told only 2 people about the gala: Noah, my friend in the materials lab, and Aunt Valerie. Noah offered to help with the booth design and lighting. Valerie sent a single sentence that made me pause longer than I expected. She wrote, "I always knew you'd arrive, Olivia, and I'm glad you're walking in on your own terms." I screenshotted it and saved it to my locked photo folder. Meanwhile, Sophia's wedding content ramped up on social media. My face appeared only once in a blurry Instagram story, half cut off beside a rack of robes. The caption said, "Bridesmaids in the wild." I read it in the campus cafe while waiting for a 3D print to finish. No one tagged me. At dinner with the family 3 nights before the wedding, my father raised a toast to Sophia and her visionary attention to detail. Then he looked at me and said, "And Olivia, thank you for being so supportive during all this. Your help hasn't gone unnoticed." I nodded, not because I believed him, but because I didn't want to ruin the illusion. I had learned that the Dunn family only recognized obedience, not truth. Later that evening, Sophia approached me on the balcony. "Listen," she said, her tone quieter than usual. "I know this wedding is a lot, and I know you're like into your school stuff, but just don't make this about you. Okay? Not this week." I smiled, a calm one, the kind that doesn't show teeth. Then I said I wouldn't dream of it, because I wasn't going to make it about me. I was going to make it about the truth. 2 days before the wedding, I walked into the museum, where the gala would be held, clipboard in hand, rehearsing my speech under my breath. My exhibit was already assembled, positioned near the south wing, surrounded by pieces from RISD and Parsons students, whose names were already being whispered in industry circles. Waitlist stood quietly in the corner, deceptively simple, its tension wires and minimal structure inviting viewers to interact without knowing exactly how it would respond. It looked like it didn't belong, much like me. But that afternoon, the program director came by with a team from a sustainable architecture firm and introduced me without needing to glance at her notes. I answered every question clearly without trying to impress. I didn't mention my GPA. I didn't talk about how I'd built the entire thing on a shoestring budget while juggling deadlines from a family that viewed me more as a task than a person. I just spoke about form, function, and emotional memory. At one point, a designer named Jules tapped the frame of my piece and said, "This feels like something meant to outlast trends." I nodded, trying not to let the words dig too deep, because I wasn't used to being described that way. When I left the museum, the sun had dropped behind the city, casting everything in amber. I hadn't checked my phone all day. There were 17 missed messages in the family group chat, most of them revolving around centerpieces and rehearsal seating. At the bottom was a single message from my mother. "Olivia, please remember this weekend is about unity, not disruption." That word. Disruption. It followed me like perfume I hadn't chosen. I had disrupted nothing. I had simply stopped disappearing. At dinner that evening, I sat across from Lisa at a long table, dressed in eucalyptus garlands and crystal menus. She pointed to my silver pendant and said, "Is that from a student market? It's very indie." Sophia turned just slightly enough to catch my expression. I didn't react. I had learned that reacting only confirmed their image of me: sensitive, difficult, dramatic. I took a sip of water and asked Lisa how her internship at a PR firm was going. She lit up immediately, forgetting her dig. That was the trick. Let them talk until they revealed themselves. After dessert, the floor was opened for toasts. My dad stood first, glass in hand, and said to Sophia, our family's star, and to Elliot, who's lucky to be joining our legacy. There was a pause, then a laugh. My mom dabbed the corner of her eye. I waited for something. Anything, but my name wasn't mentioned. Not as a helper. Not even as a guest. Just absence disguised as structure. Elliot, to his credit, raised his glass in my direction briefly, as if acknowledging the oversight, but said nothing. I appreciated the gesture, even if it was too late. The real crack came later, in the hallway outside the ballroom. I was walking toward the powder room when I heard Sophia's voice from the other side of a half-open door. "Honestly, if Olivia doesn't show up to the rehearsal brunch, it might be better. She throws off the energy." I stopped mid-step. Elliot replied, his voice quieter. "You really think she's trying to steal your spotlight?" Sophia exhaled sharply. "No, I think she just doesn't get how important this is. She's always been on another wavelength." My hand froze on the wall. Another wavelength. That's how they saw me. Not different, not focused. Just detached, irrelevant. Later that night, in my childhood room, now refitted as a guest suite with no trace of who I used to be, I opened my laptop and stared at the invitation I'd received earlier that day. The design firm Jules worked for had requested a second meeting. They wanted to discuss licensing the concept of waitlist for a European urban living project. My hands hovered over the keyboard, then I clicked accept. Below that email was another one from the gala committee, asking if I'd be available for a press photo with the other featured designers at 4:30 p.m. on the day of the wedding. I stared at the time. It overlapped almost perfectly with Sophia's vow rehearsal. I had a choice to make, one that would define not just that weekend but the shape of every weekend after it. I packed my gala outfit carefully in a black garment bag and hid it behind a row of old coats in the hallway closet. I also printed my design statement, 2 extra portfolios, and tucked them into my backpack. When I zipped it up, I felt calm. Not bold, not smug, just steady. I didn't know what would happen. I didn't know if anyone would notice or if I'd even get the moment I needed to say what mattered. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to apologize anymore for having something to say. The morning of the wedding rehearsal began with controlled chaos. My mother paced around the suite with a clipboard, her heels echoing across the marble. The makeup artist arrived late, Lisa was complaining about the playlist, and Sophia was flipping through printed itineraries like a stressed-out CEO. I sat quietly in a corner, sipping lukewarm tea, wearing the blush-toned satin robe with bridesmaid embroidered in gold thread that Sophia had ordered in bulk. The robe was 3 sizes too large, and the monogram felt ironic. I was not there to stand beside her. I was there to fill a visual quota. No one asked why I seemed quiet. No one noticed that I kept checking the time on my phone, silently counting down the minutes to 4:30 p.m., when I would have to be at the museum across town for the gala portrait. During breakfast, my father gave another speech, this one shorter but no less self-congratulatory. He praised Sophia for her taste, her vision, her attention to detail. He mentioned how proud he was to walk her down the aisle, and how this wedding symbolized legacy, beauty, and values passed from one generation to the next. He didn't look at me once. Neither did my mother, who had apparently decided I was too unpredictable to include in the emotional script of the day. When the time came for family photos, the photographer began arranging everyone without my name being called. It wasn't until Aunt Valerie noticed that she gently interrupted and said Olivia should be in this frame. My mother hesitated, then smiled tightly and waved me forward. I stood to the side, not touching anyone, and smiled in the same way I'd learned to in school group photos, just enough to pass, not enough to stand out. By the time we got to the venue for the rehearsal walk, the sun was high and the tension was higher. Sophia's voice sharpened every time someone asked a question. Lisa was dictating seating placement while ignoring the actual planner. And Elliot, who had mostly stayed out of the chaos, was now trying to calm down his parents, who were unimpressed with the flower arrangements. It was around 4:10 when I stepped into the powder room, pulled off the satin robe, and changed into a navy blue dress I had designed myself for the gala. The dress was simple in silhouette but detailed in form-structured seams, an asymmetrical neckline and fabric that caught light like moving water. I fixed my hair into a low twist, added a pair of earrings Valerie had given me the night before, and slipped my portfolio into a black canvas bag. When I walked out of the bathroom and crossed the lobby toward the exit, no one stopped me. They were all too busy preserving the image. I took a cab to the museum in silence, watching the city blur past the window. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't falter when I arrived at the gala and introduced myself to the event coordinator. I stood for photographs with the other finalists, smiling not out of duty but out of quiet pride. One of the judges stopped by my display again and asked if I had time for an interview with a European design magazine. I said yes. I answered every question with clarity, grounding each choice I made in research, narrative, and constraint. It wasn't about trends, it wasn't about visibility, it was about intention. After the formal part of the event, I checked my phone. 23 missed messages. Sophia, my mom, Lisa, even Elliot. The tone moved from confused to angry to panicked. Where are you? You missed the family toast. Sophia is furious. This is not okay. My father's message simply said, "You've made your choice." I put the phone down without replying. I knew they would be back at the hotel by now, preparing for the rehearsal dinner, going over timing, confirming speeches. And I knew exactly what I was going to do next. I picked up the black garment bag I had hidden the night before and walked into the side hallway near the museum's main staircase. There I changed into my bridesmaid dress, took one last photo of Weightless, and walked out into the night, carrying both versions of myself in the same breath. It wasn't a dramatic rebellion. It wasn't about vengeance. It was the simple, deliberate act of choosing where I needed to be and showing up fully. The gala wasn't a distraction from my family's big weekend. It was my own milestone, earned, built, and delivered without anyone's help. And for the first time, I wasn't hiding that truth behind quiet nods or strategic silence. The morning of the wedding was pale and quiet, the kind of silence that doesn't calm you but tightens around your chest. I was already awake when the sun came in through the guest room curtains, the bridesmaid dress hanging from the closet door like a costume I hadn't chosen. My phone buzzed with messages from Sophia and my mother, reminding me of makeup times, hair rotations, photo slots, and of course expectations. I didn't reply. I packed everything I needed into my black tote, the proof of who I was, the work I'd done, and the offer letters I hadn't shared. I zipped it closed and sat on the edge of the bed, taking one last look at the version of myself they knew. I wasn't going to destroy anything, I was just done letting them misname me. At the venue, everything looked polished, intentional, expensive. The courtyard was dressed in white hydrangeas and clean lines, a mirror of Sophia's Pinterest boards brought to life. Guests were arriving. Photographers were already circling, and a string quartet played something classical I didn't recognize. When I walked past the security line, no one stopped me. I wasn't late enough to cause a scene, but I wasn't early enough to be folded back into their script either. Inside the bridal suite, Sophia's makeup artist looked up startled. "You're cutting it close." Sophia didn't look at me at all. She was sitting by the window having her lashes done, drinking green tea through a straw. Lisa handed me a curling iron and said I'd have to do my hair myself, they were running behind. I nodded and walked to the far corner, plugged in the iron and stared at myself in the mirror. 10 minutes before the ceremony, we lined up in formation, Sophia's bridesmaids in order of favor, symmetry, and height. I was last. No one said anything, but I could feel the architecture of dismissal like a design flaw no one wanted to address. My father came in, straightening his tie, glowing with pride. He kissed Sophia on the forehead and said, "You look like your mother did the day we got married." My mother smiled and blinked too fast. Neither looked in my direction. I wasn't surprised. The ceremony started exactly on time. The music swelled, the crowd stood, and Sophia appeared at the top of the steps, glowing in white silk, her veil caught in a light breeze like something rehearsed. I stood at the back holding the bouquet I'd been given without a word. Elliot looked nervous but polished. His parents looked satisfied. And everything went exactly as it was supposed to until the officiant asked for the wedding programs. That's when the planner came to me whispering that they needed a backup. I offered to get them from the reception room, and no one questioned me. That was the moment I'd been waiting for. I walked calmly to the reception hall, where the setup was complete, but still empty. The tables were draped in linen place cards, lined up menus embossed. I placed my black tote at the speech podium, pulled out my folder, and began laying out the truth. On the white tablecloth, I placed my gala photos, my offer letter from the Paris design firm, a copy of the Sienna shortlist, and my thesis documentation. I left a printed version of my design essay, the one being translated into German and Japanese. At the center, I placed a note card with 5 words in block letters: "This is what I built." I didn't wait for them to find it. I returned to the ceremony, just as they were signing the marriage certificate. Sophia caught my eye, briefly confused, then focused back on the pen. Elliot looked up at me and gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. When the guests transitioned to the reception, I stayed behind for a moment. I needed to breathe. Not from anxiety, but from something quieter. Relief, maybe. Or closure. When they entered the reception room, it didn't take long. Lisa saw the display first and called Sophia over. Sophia froze. My father was next, and I saw it happen. The confusion, the calculation, the realization that everything they thought they knew had been rearranged. My mother took the longest to respond. She touched the edge of the folder as if it might burn her. Then she looked around, trying to spot me in the crowd. I stayed where I was near the back, saying nothing. I didn't need to explain anymore. The work spoke louder than I ever had. The reception had barely started when the ripple effect began. I didn't need to see it to know. The shift in mood was audible before it was visible, glasses clinking with too much force, voices dropping then rising in half whispers. I stayed near the outer edge of the room, watching the slow unspooling from a distance. Sophia stood frozen in front of the table I had arranged, reading the headline of my research feature twice, as if trying to decode a foreign language. Elliot stood beside her, flipping through the portfolio pages, not with judgment, but with quiet focus. Lisa was the first to speak loudly enough for others to hear. "What is this supposed to be? A resume drop at someone else's wedding?" My father didn't answer. He was staring at the job offer from Paris, his brow furrowed like he had just realized the foundation under his version of me wasn't as solid as he believed. My mother looked down, not at the documents, but at the words I had handwritten. "This is what I built." No one said my name until Aunt Valerie walked over and placed a hand on my shoulder. "They needed to see it," she said softly. And they weren't going to, unless you showed them like this. I nodded, still calm. I wasn't here for applause. I wasn't here for confrontation. I just wanted the record corrected. Eventually Sophia approached. Her dress was perfect, her expression was not. She looked at me, then back at the display. So this is what you've been doing behind everyone's back. Her voice wasn't angry. It was something worse. Disappointed. Not because I'd done something wrong, but because she hadn't seen it coming. I let the silence stretch long enough to let that land. It wasn't behind anyone's back, I said. You just never asked. Elliot came forward before she could respond. He extended his hand, not in formality, but in respect. Your work is brilliant, he said, his tone low and steady. You should be incredibly proud. Sophia's eyes narrowed. This isn't the time, Elliot. He looked at her, then really looked, and replied, maybe it's exactly the time. Behind them, guests started murmuring. A few distant relatives approached the table, curious. One of them, my mother's cousin, turned to me and said, why didn't anyone tell us you'd done all this? I smiled politely without bitterness. There wasn't room in the family narrative. The woman blinked, not quite understanding, but sensing the weight of it. My father finally spoke. You should have told us, he said. You should have given us a chance to support you. I looked at him steady. You supported a version of me that never existed. And I played along because it was easier than being told I was wrong about myself. My mother took a step forward, her voice softer. I didn't know how to balance it. You were quiet, and Sophia always needed so much. I thought you preferred the background. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because that sentence explained everything and nothing. I preferred not being compared to someone you already decided was the gold standard, I said. But that's not the same as choosing invisibility. She looked down, her hands clutched tightly in front of her, like she was holding on to something that had already slipped away. Sophia stood motionless. Then she turned to Elliot, voice strained. Are we still going to pretend this day isn't about us? Elliot didn't answer immediately. When he did, he said, it is about us. But it's also about honesty. And from where I'm standing, Olivia's honesty is the only reason this moment feels real. That was the crack. The first undeniable tear in the image Sophia had curated so meticulously. For a second I felt a pang of guilt, but it passed. I hadn't taken anything from her. I had simply claimed what was already mine. The rest of the night moved like a dream. Guests danced, plates were cleared, toasts were delivered. But the center of gravity had shifted. People glanced at me differently now. Not everyone. Not instantly, but enough to feel it. I stayed until the end, thanked the planner, and walked alone through the lobby while the crowd moved toward the farewell brunch setup. My family didn't stop me. But Valerie hugged me tight and whispered, you did it your way. That's what matters. It was never about proving them wrong. It was about no longer pretending they were right. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The air in my hotel room felt unusually still, like something had settled but hadn't quite found its final shape. My phone was filled with unread messages, some from guests who had been at the wedding, others from people I barely remembered speaking to. Some were warm, some were surprised. A few were from former professors congratulating me on the article. One message stood out. It was from Elliot. Just 2 sentences. I'm sorry I didn't know sooner. I see it now. I didn't reply immediately. I wanted to let that sentence breathe on its own. There was no post-wedding brunch for me. I skipped the official family gathering. Instead, I walked through the city clear-headed for the first time in months. I realized I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded. What I had done wasn't revenge, it was truth unveiled without permission. I didn't make a scene. I just changed the frame. And now that the frame was mine, I didn't owe anyone the same script anymore. Later that day, I sat in a cafe and finally opened the message my father had sent at midnight. It was longer than usual. He said he had read my article 3 times. He said he didn't agree with everything, but he couldn't deny the effort or the impact. He ended by writing, "You've always been more than we gave you credit for. I'm sorry it took this for us to see it." There was no promise of change, no guarantee of healing, just a crack in the door I had long stopped knocking on. Sophia hadn't written. That didn't surprise me. Her silence spoke louder than any argument. She was the kind of person who needed the spotlight to orient herself. And for one moment, just one, I had disrupted that gravity. That wasn't something she'd forgive quickly. Maybe not ever. But it wasn't my responsibility to manage her perception anymore. For years, I had contorted myself to fit the space left over, after her presence filled the room. Now I had my own room, my own view, my own light. I flew back to Boston the following evening. My apartment felt smaller than I remembered, but it was mine. The quiet was no longer suffocating, it was earned. I unpacked slowly, and when I opened the folder with the Paris contract again, I didn't hesitate. I signed it, no ceremony, no hesitation. Just a decision made in full presence. For once, the next chapter didn't require anyone's permission. 2 days later, my mother called. I answered, surprised at myself. Her voice was softer than usual, like she was testing the air between us. She didn't ask questions. She just said, I saw the photos. You looked strong. I thanked her. Then she added, I want to understand more, if you'll let me. That was the first sentence she'd said to me in years that didn't try to correct me. I said we could meet, but not now. I needed space to live in this new version of myself, without slipping back into the roles that once defined me. At work, things shifted too. My boss called me in to congratulate me not just on the feature but on the clarity of voice I had finally owned. He offered me a new role, one that allowed me to lead a creative team under my own name. I accepted, quietly, the same way I had accepted most things in life, but this time with intention instead of resignation. On Friday, I received a package, no return address. Inside was a photograph from the wedding taken by a guest. I hadn't seen it before. In it, I'm standing by my table mid-conversation with Elliot. Sophia is in the background, turned away. The note attached simply read, You didn't need the spotlight. You created your own light. There was no signature. I smiled. There was a time when I would have dismissed a moment like that as dramatic. But now I understood the value of subtle truths, of quiet pivots, of unseen foundations finally made visible. I wasn't angry. I wasn't vindictive. I was simply done being invisible in my own life. I made tea that night and looked at my calendar. Paris was in 6 weeks, enough time to prepare to close a few chapters and to step fully into one that didn't start with compromise. I thought back to the wedding, to the ultimatum, to the silence at that long table, when they realized the version of me they ignored had already grown too large to ignore. My story hadn't ended that night. It had just become mine. 3 weeks before I left for Paris, I attended a small gathering at a colleague's home. It was the kind of quiet creative salon Olivia would have avoided a year ago thinking she didn't belong. But I wasn't hiding anymore. I no longer felt like an outsider observing life from the edges of my own story. People spoke to me differently now. Not just because of what I had written, but because I occupied my space differently. I answered questions without shrinking. I asked questions without trying to impress. I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore, just share what I knew and listen with more intention than before. One of the guests there was an older writer named Jean. He had a soft, deliberate way of speaking, like every word mattered. After an hour of conversation, he asked if I had ever considered teaching. I said no, not because I wasn't capable, but because I thought no one would take me seriously. He just looked at me and said, That's a mirror, not a truth. I didn't reply, but I wrote that sentence down when I got home. Later that night, I opened the teaching fellowship applications I had once bookmarked and never touched again. I didn't apply right away, but I didn't close the tab either. At the office, I noticed something strange. Some of my coworkers, people who had barely acknowledged me before, began asking for my input on things outside my usual scope. Not in a performative way, but with genuine curiosity. I think they had assumed I was just another quiet junior editor who would stay quiet forever. But now they were starting to realize that silence when chosen holds more weight than noise. And maybe, just maybe, the voice behind that silence had more to say than they thought. 2 weeks before the flight, I saw Sophia's name pop up on my phone. For a second, I thought it was a mistake. But she had texted, I heard you're leaving. Can we talk before you go? I stared at the message for 5 full minutes. Then I replied, If you're coming to listen, yes. If you're coming to defend, no. She sent back just one word. understood. We met at a public park, the same one where we used to bike as kids, before the distance between us became formalized by expectations and comparisons. She didn't wear makeup, she didn't carry her usual curated composure. It was the first time in years she looked like my sister, instead of a polished performance. We sat for 15 minutes without speaking, then she began. She said she hadn't read the whole article, just pieces of it that mutual friends had shared. At first she thought it was an attack. Then she said she realized it wasn't about her at all. It was about the version of myself I had tried to become while orbiting around her light. She said she didn't know that I had felt so invisible. I didn't interrupt. I just listened. Eventually I spoke. I told her I didn't hate her. I had admired her for so long that it took me years to realize admiration and self-erasure aren't the same thing. I said I wasn't angry at her for shining. I was just done dimming myself to keep everyone comfortable. She nodded, but didn't respond right away. Then she asked, "Do you think we'll ever be close again?" I told her the truth. I didn't know. I hoped so. But not at the cost of either of us shrinking to fit the other's frame. She accepted that. For once, she didn't try to rewrite my answer. A week later, I packed my final box. The apartment looked bare again. I left the plants with my neighbor, left the keys with my landlord, and took one last look at the empty space where I had once curled up crying after family calls. That version of Olivia was still a part of me, but she no longer drove the story. At the airport, my phone buzzed. It was my father. A photo of me as a child on his shoulders captioned, "Proud of you. Always should have been." I didn't cry. I smiled. It wasn't about them anymore. Their validation when offered was welcome, but no longer required. As the plane took off, I didn't feel like I was escaping. I felt like I was arriving finally into a life where I didn't have to trade truth for peace or worth for proximity. I wasn't running from a toxic family system. I was building something beyond it. Something rooted not in opposition but in clarity. And sometimes, clarity is the quietest, strongest kind of power. When I arrived in Paris, I didn't unpack right away. The apartment was small, tucked behind a café in Montmartre, with a slanted ceiling and windows that let in morning light like it had been filtered through memory. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while, letting the silence settle. It was a different kind of silence than what I had known at home. Not the heavy, watchful kind. This one felt like space being made for something new to exist. I didn't speak to anyone for the first 2 days except the baker downstairs, who smiled at me with the kind of warmth that didn't ask for anything in return. I liked that. It reminded me I didn't have to explain myself to be accepted. I just had to exist, and that was enough. My work here was part of a fellowship, nothing glamorous but meaningful. I was assisting on a project about identity and transition, helping collect stories from immigrant women working in small trades. The interviews were raw and grounding. Women who had lost languages, countries, children, but still moved forward. Their strength wasn't loud. It was stitched into the quiet choices they made every morning. Listening to them, I realized how little of my own story I had ever fully claimed. I had written about it, yes, but always through the lens of distance or detachment. Here I began to speak about it. Not perform it. Not prove it. Just speak it. One afternoon, I was invited to a local university to guest speak. I said yes before I had time to second-guess myself. The students were mostly women, some barely older than I had been when everything with my family began to unravel. I told them about what it meant to grow up in a house where love felt conditional, where achievement was a currency and affection was a prize. I spoke about the ache of being invisible next to someone who always shined, and how easy it is to believe that silence equals failure. When I finished, no one clapped right away. There was just stillness. Then, a girl in the back raised her hand and said, "Thank you." That's the first time someone described my life without making it sound like a tragedy. That night, I wrote my father a letter. Not for closure, not for forgiveness, just to finish a conversation that I had been carrying inside me for years. I told him I no longer resented him for protecting an illusion of harmony over truth. I told him I understood now that control often comes from fear, and fear often hides behind disappointment. But I also told him that love, if it's real, doesn't have to be earned in installments. It just is, or it isn't. I didn't ask for a response. I didn't send the letter right away. I just folded it, placed it between the pages of the notebook I now used for teaching, and let it rest. By the end of my first month in Paris, something unexpected had happened. I wasn't waiting to be seen anymore. I wasn't rehearsing comebacks or fantasizing about confrontations. I was living fully and unconditionally as the person I had once believed I needed permission to become. My days were filled with questions, mistakes, translations, laughter. No one here knew about the wedding ultimatum or the years of being erased by my own family. They just knew Olivia. A woman who showed up on time, listened closely, and asked good questions. That it turned out was enough to belong. The day I finally mailed the letter, it wasn't because I wanted to reopen wounds. It was because I had nothing left to prove. My story wasn't about vengeance. It was about reclaiming authorship. And I had done that. Not by yelling, not by winning an argument, but by surviving with my softness intact. I didn't hear back from my father for weeks. Then one morning I got an email, short 6 sentences. He said he had read the letter 3 times, said he never knew I saw him that clearly. Said he wasn't ready to say much more, but he was proud, and he was listening now. No grand apology, no sudden transformation, but in a way it was more than I expected. Because sometimes the real victory isn't getting people to change. It's changing how much power their approval has over you. And in that quiet shift, you win more than just a fight. You win yourself. By the time summer came around, I wasn't the same girl who used to sit quietly at family dinners calculating every sentence, wondering if I'd accidentally offended someone by existing. Paris didn't just change how I saw the world, it changed how I located myself inside it. I had gone from begging for inclusion to building something that no one could exclude me from. That shift didn't come from rage. It came from clarity. And once I tasted it, I stopped asking for the bare minimum. It happened gradually, like most real changes do. I started showing my students parts of the book I had been too nervous to publish before. I got an email one day from a small press in New York. They had read one of my essays and asked if I had more. I almost didn't reply. Not because I didn't want it, but because I had gotten so used to rejection from the people closest to me that I assumed strangers wouldn't treat me any better. But they did. They weren't interested in who my father was or how polished my sister's life looked on paper. They cared about the voice, about the truth, and that truth didn't need decoration to be powerful. Back home, my sister got married without me. I saw a few filtered photos on social media, matching bridesmaids. A perfect arch of flowers. Nothing about it surprised me. What surprised me was how little it hurt. I had spent so long thinking I needed to witness their milestones to prove I was still part of the story, but I wasn't part of that version anymore. I had stepped out of a house of mirrors, and I didn't want to go back inside just to feel seen again. A few weeks after the wedding, I received a message from my cousin. It was short. She said she had read my piece in a university journal and cried. Not because it was sad, but because she had felt invisible her whole life too, and didn't know anyone else understood that ache. That message meant more than any invite ever could, because it reminded me that being cut off doesn't mean being alone. Sometimes it means being redirected toward people who see you fully. One afternoon, I walked past a vintage bookstore near my apartment and saw my essay printed in a literary zine displayed in the window. I stood there for a long time, not for validation but for closure. This was the version of my life that I had written myself, not out of spite, not out of revenge, but out of a need to document what erasure feels like when it comes from the people who once rocked you to sleep. And how powerful it can be when you find the courage to rewrite your place in the world without asking anyone's permission. Somewhere in a box back in my old room, if that room still exists, I imagine my family keeps a version of me that no longer fits. The quiet one, the grateful one, the invisible peacekeeper. They can keep her. I'm not her anymore. I am not angry, and I'm not bitter. I just finally understand that survival doesn't have to look like endurance. Sometimes survival is soft. Sometimes, survival is letting go before it costs you more than it gives. I don't know if my father ever read the final version of my book. I didn't send it. Not out of spite, but because I no longer needed to. He lives in a world where I only exist if I comply. I live in one where I exist, because I chose to. That's the difference. That's the freedom. I once thought being cut off was the worst thing that could happen to me. But maybe the real tragedy would have been staying where I wasn't seen just to avoid the loneliness that comes with liberation. Because what I found on the other side of silence wasn't emptiness, it was space. Space to breathe, to write, to be. And maybe that's the question I leave for anyone watching this, especially if you've been made to feel like your value is conditional. What if the version of you they rejected is the exact one the world has been waiting to hear from?